I think the two major influences are technology and the regulatory mandates. From a technology standpoint, digital X-ray has eliminated the need for wet film processing and the darkroom in general. So that was a gain to the space planning process. And then the implementation of the milling machine for patients who are getting crowns in a one-stop visit has changed that whole format. So now we've accommodated space for that piece of equipment and the technologies that go with it digitally. The aspect of regulatory mandates, HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and ADA, Americans with Disability Act, both have been brought to the forefront and have increased the demand for patient confidentiality and accessibility to all persons. So from a HIPAA standpoint, we're finding that we need to accommodate more space for persons to be able to communicate with the administration in a private manner. And similarly with accommodations for the disabled, there has to be a facility that will be accessible to them visually and physically. So counter heights and all of those accommodations must be met. So those are the two major things. And then life safety regulations have been advanced considerably in the last 20 years, and that's all considerations for being safe, leaving a facility, having enough means of egress, having travel distances that are going to be reasonable enough or circulatory enough to accommodate ease in exiting a space during a crisis. So those are the major things that have had an influence and impact over the years. Essentially, the biggest thing you have to do is manage the investment overall, but that is not exclusive to a monetary definition of costs versus expense. And that can't be accomplished without having the knowledge of all of the components that go into designing an office. So a designer must have a very, very clear understanding of the clinical and administrative operations, all the regulatory mandates, which I mentioned earlier, building zoning regulations, and construction services, techniques, and ability to develop a facility. All of that, and knowing the right questions to ask for each of the people who are involved in the facility operations. So without that, you can't control the input of proper information to get what you want for an efficient plan overall. The ability to communicate these ideas both verbally and in narrative and graphically on architectural prints is again essential, and it's a matter of managing costs because details that are on the plans are what is basically your contract. The written words that are in a contractual agreement that say that contractor X is going to provide ZY services, not in effect the total contract. All the contract is in the numerous drawings that have power, plumbing, framing, lighting, electrical. All of those details must be very, very well defined. So it comes from the base knowledge and then to the articulation and communication and then implementation, and that's your guarantee that the work will be done effectively and in a cost-effective manner. Everything comes down to the amount of space that we need to facilitate the needs of the practice. So when we're doing calculations of need, we establish the appropriate sizes for the lab, sterilization, treatment room, consultation, waiting area, all of those. And it's relatively simple to do that. But in the overall picture, we have to include all of the essentials that make that, thus the skeleton of the office. And that includes the partitions, and people often overlook that in their calculations because they don't see it as a space-consuming entity. The average wall is 5 inches thick times a linear dimension of a few hundred feet. Often between that and the passageways to get in and out of the office to provide accessibility to egresses, second means of egress, third means of egress. All of that takes space, and we find that typically you can eat up as much as 20 to 30% of the available space in that accommodation, particularly if there are challenges in the configuration of the space. One of the most important things about planning an office is the ergonomics, and that comes down not only to the hands-on operation of a treatment room, clinical support area, and administrative space, but the juxtaposition or orientation of the support services to each of those individual services. So ideally, we would want to put a sterilization area and a lab in close proximity to the treatment rooms. We also have to be cognizant of the fact that there are sounds, odors, and other impositions from those rooms. So we don't want to have them in too close a proximity, but we do want to have them in an efficient alignment so that they're going to enhance the operation and not in any way detract from it. Well, let me highlight just a couple of things with each. From a zoning standpoint, there are what they refer to as setbacks, the distance between the structure and the adjacent properties. And that varies depending on the type of zoning. So if it's a commercial zone or a residential zone, the difference would be a greater amount of space between a residential zone and a structure on an adjacent property than it would be in commercial. Some commercial properties will allow you to pave right up to the edge of that property. Others will require screening and other visual blocks that will help with the environment of the space that you're encroaching upon. But by itself, we have those setbacks that have to be complied with. If in fact there is not enough space to make those accommodations, you're going to diminish or limit the amount of space that you can develop. Several people who have purchased pieces of land and found that there wasn't enough room for the amount of parking that they needed and the ability to build a structure that would give them as much square footage as they would need. So another alignment to that is that a new development may have the need, or would have the need, for paved surfaces for parking. And what has to happen is that you have to manage the water on the site. So if you have a porous soil surface and have now changed that to an impervious surface, all the water that collects on that impervious surface now has to be still managed on the site rather than let it spill to an adjacent property. So that has to be managed with catch basins and drainage, so storm sewers and so on. So quite critical that you comply with all those things, and certainly the bottom line with any of these things is that if those needs are not met, if those requirements have not been complied with, you're not going to get the permit to do the work that you'd like to do. In association with that, from a building standpoint, probably the most important thing is life safety, and I've referred to that earlier with means of egress. The greatest concern for most building officials is to be certain that anyone who's in a facility during a time of some catastrophe, be it a fire or other problem, that they can exit the building safely. And if in fact the plans do not define that all of these compliances have been met, building officials are not going to provide a permit for you to build the facility as you've designed it. So it's again critical that there be a knowledge of all the zoning regulations and all the building regulations, so these compliances are met in the process as the plan is being developed, that aesthetically and functionally it may be a great looking plan, but if in fact these components have not been considered in the configuration of that space, it's going to have to be rethought and replanned. I think that one of the most challenging aspects of developing an office is maintaining the knowledge about all of the regulations that are changed throughout time. We've gone in the last few years from BOCA building regulations to the International Building Code. And with those changes came new definitions, and some for the betterment, some are a little more challenging to meet. But be that as it may, we've had incidences where what has been established for many, many years has changed. There are changes that take place at different times, and it's incumbent upon the designers and architects to meet those and stay abreast of what's going on.